When we're thinking about patterns of assimilation, uh, one of the things that we need to think about is ethnic succession. This is a second factor that shaped the assimilation experience is captured in the concept of ethnic succession, or the myriad of ways in which European ethnic groups unintentionally affected each other's position in the social class structure of the larger society. Um, One subcategory is politics. After a period of acculturation and adjustment, the Irish, of course, began to create their own connections with the mainstream society and improve their economic and social position. Even though they were primarily a labor force, they started to figure out how to um, make their way in American society. One of their strategies, and one of the strategies of many of these groups that were that second wave, were labor unions. The labor movement provided a second link between the Irish and other European immigrant groups and the larger society. Um, it also allowed them to exercise power through these unions and make demands on the corporate class or the ruling elite that they would not have been able to make without the unions themselves. Religion was another aspect of ethnic succession. This is a third avenue of mobility for the Irish and other white groups. Was ultimately provided by their religious institutions. Even though Catholicism was not accepted as the right religion in the United States, there were certainly a lot of them. And once they started to organize around their religious practices, they started to find themselves with the ability to make demands on the larger society. Some other other pathways to think about: sports, and of course, the age-old criminal activity. Uh, don't knock crime until you try it. It just might get you somewhere. That's certainly a available option for many of these folks that are trying to make their way in a new land where um, they're not totally comfortable with the assimilation process and choose to seek out other ways to make it in the United States. Uh, Another pattern of assimilation is this idea of continuing industrialization and structural mobility. Structural mobility results from more from changes in the structure of the economy and the labor market than from any individual or effort or desire to get ahead. Um, so it wasn't the floor manager in a car company that made the car company. It was the availability of the market. And when the market went away, those jobs went away. It wasn't because any one person did or did not do their jobs. It's because the structure of the economy changed, and all of a sudden, the factories that were once there were no longer there. One aspect that we cannot underestimate in reference to the first group for sure, and even the second group that assimilated into the United States during the 1820s and 1920s, is this idea of degree of similarity. Uh, the degree of resistance, prejudice, and discrimination encountered by the different European immigrant groups varied in part by the degree in which they differed from these dominant group characteristics. So the record number of Southern and Eastern Europeans arriving in new immigration or in the new immigration of the early 20s raised the fears that U.S. cities and institutions would be swamped by hordes of what were seen as racially inferior, assimilable immigrants. This group of people that did not share the cultural characteristics of the dominant population. Therefore, a preference hierarchy was formed in the U.S. culture that privileged Northern and Western Europeans over Southern and Eastern Europeans. And of course, Protestants over Catholics and Jews. The hierarchy of ethnic preference is still a major part of American prejudice, although it's much more muted today. The idea that the Americas, or that the United States of America is a Protestant religious country is still believed by many. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's what WASP stands for, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And that was what the primary assimilation beliefs in Anglo-conformity were certainly drawing off of. Religion was another major determining factor in the immigrant experience. Kennedy found the immigrant generation chose marriage partners from a pool whose boundaries were marked not just by ethnicity, but also by religion. As children and grandchildren of immigrants married based on religion, mostly based on religion, but less so based on ethnicity. This is still a question today. Oh, you're marrying a Catholic? Are you going to become part of the Catholic religion? Oh, you're marrying a Protestant? Are you going to become part of the Protestant religion? There's this idea that because one marries, someone has to give up their own religious preferences. Herberg talked about acculturation, and said it didn't affect all aspects of ethnicity equally. European immigrants were encouraged to learn English, for example, but not to change their religious beliefs. Religion became a vehicle by which immigrants could convey their ethnicity. And it was also one of the underlying protections in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights. The idea that you can practice whatever religion you want to in the United States and not be persecuted because of it. Social class is another characteristic or essential feature of social structure that affected immigrants. Milton Gordon argued that the U.S. in the 1960s had not 3, but 4 melting pots, one for each of the major ethnic religious groups and one for Black Americans, which were subdivided by class. He believed the intersection of religious, ethnic, and social class boundaries, or eth-class, was the most significant structural unit in U.S. society. He also believed that social class affected structural integration. There's also the idea of sojourners, or birds of passage, if you will. Some immigrants had no intention of becoming American citizens and therefore had little interest in Americanization. These were groups that were leaving where they were at to come to the United States to make money, to ship back home, and they would ultimately return back where they came from. They had no interest in becoming American. They just wanted to make American money to send it back home so they could live a better life due to the work that they do in the United States. We also need to think about the descendants of European immigrants today. As I mentioned earlier, our largest ancestry group is German American. When we think about integration and equality, white ethnic groups are today on the verge of being completely assimilated. And those of color, those groups of color, are having a real hard time assimilating. Another thing to think about is the evolution of white ethnicity. Hanson's principle of third generation interests. What the second generation tries to forget, the third generation tries to remember. And as we speak, we are experiencing an ethnic revival, or a notable increase in the visibility of an interest in white ethnic heritage. This is what the election of Donald Trump represented. A rekindling of those fires of ethnicity, white ethnic heritage, and its dilution, and a group of people in this country voicing that they have a problem with that. Some, on the other hand, think that we're on the twilight of white ethnicity, that symbolic ethnicity, or an aspect of self-identity that symbolizes one's roots in the old country, are going away. Gallagher proposed an addendum to Hanson's principle. He said, what the grandson wished to remember, the great-granddaughter has never been told. So, in many respects, I have always argued that we live in the United States of amnesia, and we have forgotten more about what's important to our heritage than we remember, and that's a real problem. You can see through this median household income and percentage of families living in poverty based on educational attainment for selected ethnic groups in the 1990. Some groups are doing better than others. Irish are still at the low end of the pay scale, and Russians, which includes Jews, are at the high end of the pay scale. Assimilation today is fragmented or segmented and will have a number of different outcomes. Some groups will integrate into the middle class mainstream. Others will find themselves permanently mired in the impoverished, alienated, and marginalized segments. How assimilation will happen over the next 15, 20 years is still to be seen, especially with many of the anti-immigrant policies that the United States government is putting into place right now. Some implications for examining dominant and minority relations. The minority group status has much more to do with power and the distribution of resources than with simple numbers or the percentage of the population in any particular category. Remember, minority groups aren't based on number, they're based on the amount of power and the amount of resources they gain in the struggle to sustain their livelihoods. All right, well, that is the end of section 2. Hopefully you're enjoying the class so far. This is just the beginning. We're just kind of getting through the concepts, and we're going to start taking a turn into the case studies and the examples of what this means for us. We're going to start looking at African Americans. Then we'll move into Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, Japanese Americans, and Japanese and Asian Americans, and then Arab Americans. So, yeah, things are just getting ready, folks. We're getting ready to blast off here. This is where things get a bit crazy and hopefully thought-provoking. So, yep, see you soon.